The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like machinery that hadn't been serviced in months. 2:33 a.m. The graveyard shift stretched across Oak Creek Memorial in Raleigh with that particular quality of silence only hospitals possessed, not quiet, but held breath. Megan O'Brien moved through the corridors with the kind of efficiency that made her invisible. Scrubs pressed. Badge clipped. Hair pulled back so tight it almost hurt. She didn't belong to this place the way other nurses did. She didn't belong anywhere, and after 3 years, she'd stopped trying to pretend otherwise. The smell of antiseptic and something darker, stale coffee someone had abandoned at the nurse's station, marked the transition from the main ward into the ICU corridor. Her shoes made no sound on the tile. She'd learned long ago how to move through spaces without disturbing them, a skill that had nothing to do with nursing school and everything to do with muscle memory built in places she no longer talked about. Room for 12 sat vacant at the end of the east wing, its bed freshly laundered and waiting. She moved past it toward the medication station, checking the clock above the supply room door. The pharmacy deliveries weren't due until 4 a.m. The medication logs wouldn't be reconciled until dawn. For the next 90 minutes, the supply room belonged to nobody who was actually supposed to be there. She pushed the door open and reached for the stock bottles of morphine, needing to verify the count from yesterday's shift. Her hand froze. The restricted files, locked in the cabinet that required 2 signatures to access, sat pulled halfway out, their edges exposed under the harsh overhead light. Someone had left them accessible. Someone had made a mistake, or someone had made a choice. She didn't touch them. She didn't need to. The photograph of the handwriting was already in her mind, Dr. Marcus Ashford's signature on medication authorization forms, the dosages crossed out and rewritten in his own hand. Morphine. Fentanyl. Drugs that moved like shadows through the system, tracked but not tracked, documented but never really documented. The numbers were wrong. Systematically wrong. Consistently wrong in a pattern that suggested purpose rather than error. The door behind her opened. Dr. Ashford stood in the threshold, his white coat still bearing the crease from being pressed that morning, his tie the kind of navy that cost more than Megan made in a week. He was 48, silver threading through his dark hair in a way that looked engineered rather than natural. His eyes held the particular hardness of someone accustomed to being the most important person in every room. Their gazes met through the angle of the open cabinet door. His expression didn't change. Neither did hers. For exactly 3 seconds, the supply room held the kind of tension that preceded either understanding or ruin. He smiled. Not warmly. Not even particularly at her, but in a way that suggested he was smiling at something he'd already decided about her future. Working late, nurse. His voice carried the tone of someone asking a question to which they already knew they wouldn't receive an honest answer. Stock verification, Megan said. Her voice came out exactly as it always did, measured, professional, deferential in a way that required no actual deference. Just clarity. Just the sound of someone doing their job. Pharmacy deliveries arrive at 4. I wanted to be thorough. He stepped fully into the room, and the space between them seemed to compress. He had that kind of presence, not threatening exactly, but commanding, the way certain men moved through the world as if it had been arranged for their convenience. Thorough. He said the word like he was testing it. That's good. Thoroughness matters in medicine. In documentation. In knowing what to report and what to forget. She reached for a morphine bottle with her right hand, setting it on the counter with deliberate care. The glass made a soft contact sound against the metal. She was acutely aware of his eyes tracking the movement, looking for hesitation, for trembling, for any sign that she understood what she'd just seen and what that understanding meant. I make sure the numbers match the records, Megan said. Every time. I'm sure you do. He moved closer to the cabinet, his hand reaching toward the files. Though sometimes the records need adjusting. When discrepancies are discovered. When errors are caught. She didn't respond. She'd learned years ago that silence was a form of communication, safer than words, harder to weaponize later. Behind her steady hands, behind the cool professional manner that came as naturally to her as breathing, she was already running the calculation. He knew she'd seen. He was already deciding what to do about it. The only question was velocity. Your performance reviews have been solid, he continued, closing the file cabinet with his hip in a gesture that seemed designed to underscore his familiarity with spaces where he didn't belong. No complaints. You're quiet. Dependable. Forgettable. That's actually the ideal profile for a nurse, don't you think? Nobody pays attention to the forgettable ones. She met his eyes directly then. Just for a moment. Just long enough to show she understood he wasn't complimenting her. I focus on patient care, she said. Of course you do. He was already moving toward the door, his expression settling back into the neutral professional mask he wore around anyone who mattered. Stay thorough, Nurse O'Brien. And stay quiet about your thoroughness. There's nothing worse than someone who sees something and decides to talk about it. Creates problems for everyone. He left the supply room, and she remained standing at the medication station for exactly 14 seconds before she released the breath she'd been holding. The overhead lights hummed. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor beeped in steady rhythm. She turned back to her work with hands that remained absolutely still. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she'd already decided not to report what she'd seen. Not because she was afraid of Dr. Ashford. Not because of the implicit threat in his parting words. But because she knew how hospitals worked, and she knew how people like her, invisible people, forgettable people, people rebuilding broken lives one quiet shift at a time, were the ones who disappeared when they caused problems. She had built 3 years of anonymity at Oak Creek Memorial, one carefully measured shift after another. She had learned to make herself small enough that no one asked questions about her background, her accent when she was tired, the way her hands moved with precision that suggested they'd done things beyond inserting fours and checking vital signs. She had worn her ordinariness like armor, and she wasn't prepared to lose it. The medication count was complete by 3:23 a.m. She returned the files to their cabinet, careful to leave them exactly as Ashford had, suggesting nothing had been noticed, and moved back toward the main ward. Room for 12 sat empty as she passed, its bed waiting for an admission that would come with the morning shift. She didn't know yet that the patient arriving would be a young Marine named Corporal Davis, evacuated from Kandahar with shrapnel injuries and a recognition in his eyes that would change everything. She only knew that her careful invisible life was fracturing, and that fractures in careful invisible lives spread faster than anyone expected. The morning shift arrived at 6 a.m. Megan had already documented everything, had already made herself present without being noticed, had already created the kind of silence around herself that suggested she'd never been there at all. The day nurse, Rebecca, arrived with coffee and gossip, moving through the ward with the kind of casual comfort that came from actually belonging. "How was the graveyard?" Rebecca asked, pulling on fresh gloves at the medication station. "Quiet," Megan said. "Uneventful." Rebecca laughed. "That's the dream, right? Uneventful. I'm always terrified I'm going to get that shift where everything falls apart." Megan didn't respond. She understood, in a way that Rebecca never would, that uneventful was something you built deliberately. Uneventful was something you maintained through strategic silence and careful choices about what you could see without acknowledging you'd seen it. The intake report came through at 6:56 a.m. One admission. Room for 12. Corporal James Davis, 24, evacuated from Kandahar Regional Medical Center after blast trauma. Her hands moved on their own, pulling the 4 kit, checking the patient file, preparing the room with the kind of precision that had nothing to do with her civilian nursing training and everything to do with the training she'd received in a different life, in a different uniform, in a time when her hands had done far worse things than insert catheters. When Corporal Davis arrived at 7:13 a.m., he was pale but conscious, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body was no longer entirely under his control. Megan helped transfer him from the gurney to the hospital bed, her movements efficient and professional, her hand steady as she checked his pulse, his blood pressure, his oxygen saturation. "Vital stable," she said to the orderly. He's in good shape for post-evacuation. But Corporal Davis was looking at her. Not at her uniform. Not at her badge. Looking at her the way you looked at someone whose face had meant something once. His eyes tracked her hands as she worked, watched the way she moved around the room, studied her with an intensity that suggested recognition, trying to break through medication and pain. "Do I know you?" he asked. His voice was rough. Damaged. But the question itself was careful. "I'm your nurse," Megan said. "I'll be checking on you regularly." She adjusted his full line, feeling his eyes on her face. "Rest now. Let the medication work." She turned to leave, and she felt him watching her go. That was the moment she should have known. That was the instant when her 3 years of invisibility began to crumble. But she didn't know yet. She only knew that something in the way he'd looked at her felt dangerous. She moved back into the corridor, back into the fluorescence and the hum and the practiced silence. Her jacket was hanging in her locker. Inside the lining, sewn there 6 years ago by hands that were no longer hers, was a unit patch. A faded thing. A wing shield in marine green. She hadn't looked at it in 3 years. She wouldn't look at it now. She only knew it was there, a weight she carried without acknowledging, a piece of a life she'd packed away the same way she'd packed away her name. Major Megan O'Brien. That wasn't who she was anymore. It was someone she'd been. Someone who'd taken shrapnel defending people. Someone whose career had ended in a medical discharge that she'd learned to not discuss, the way you didn't discuss anything that hurt too much to say aloud. The shift continued. Vitals. Medications. Charts. The rhythm of the ward moved around her the way it always did, and by noon, it seemed like Corporal Davis had been absorbed into the landscape of Oak Creek Memorial like any other patient. She told herself the recognition in his eyes had been medication, had been confusion, had been the particular delirium of pain medication and displacement. She was very good at telling herself things. She'd had 3 years to practice. The charting error appeared on the unit board at 6:08 a.m., handwritten in red ink by Dr. Ashford himself. Megan saw it the moment she rounded the corner toward the break room, her name circled twice, the notation flagged as inappropriate documentation practices with 3 exclamation marks slashed beneath it. The board hung 3 feet from the nurse's station where the day shift was already gathering their assignments. Within seconds, 2 nurses she'd worked with for 2 years glanced at the board, then at her, then quickly away. She didn't stop walking. She didn't flinch. She moved past the board as if it wasn't there, though the words had already burned themselves into her vision. To Brian, see me immediately patient file violations. The break room door swung open to find Dr. Ashford waiting with his arms crossed, his tailored shirt already crisp at this hour, his expression settled into something resembling professional concern. He was 38, legacy money written into the cut of his hair and the way he held the space around him, the kind of arrogance that came from never being told no. Megan. Not Miss O'Brien. Not Nurse O'Brien. Just the name, delivered with the casualty of someone addressing a subordinate who'd disappointed him. Those files you were examining last night. The medication adjustments. I need to know exactly what you thought you were doing. She met his eyes. One measured breath. I was reviewing dosages that didn't match the attending orders. Protocol requires flagging discrepancies. Protocol. He stepped closer, his voice dropping into something softer and infinitely more dangerous. Do you know how long I've been doing this? 19 years. And in 19 years, I've never had a nurse, especially one barely holding onto her position, question my clinical judgment in the middle of the night like some kind of hospital detective. He paused, letting that land. You're not qualified to understand what you saw. And frankly, you're not qualified to be making these kinds of accusations. The word landed clean. Accusations. She hadn't accused him of anything. She'd simply noticed. But he'd already reframed her observation into something hostile, something insubordinate. I wasn't accusing anyone, Doctor. I was. You were overstepping. His voice had the texture of a blade being drawn. And now everyone on this unit is questioning whether they can trust your judgment. That write-up isn't a punishment, Megan. It's documentation. For your own protection, really. In case there are any questions later about your competency. She said nothing. The silence filled the break room like pressure building before a storm. At 9:13 a.m., during rounds on the 4th floor, Dr. Ashford found her outside room for 12. Corporal Davis's mother and father stood in the doorway, both still in yesterday's clothes, their son's medical chart open on the bedside tray. Megan had just finished checking his vitals, O2 sat at 94%, heart rate steady at 68, blood pressure holding at 118/76. The numbers were good. The Marine was improving. Mrs. Davis, Dr. Ashford said, his voice carrying the warmth he never extended to Megan, I want to address some concerns about your son's care overnight. Our nursing staff has had some documentation issues that I've been working to resolve. Megan stood at the foot of the bed, her hand steady, her face a geography of nothing at all. His full line was accessed at 11:51 p.m., Dr. Ashford continued, and while the notation says routine medication administration, I've noticed some inconsistencies in the charting that concern me. I've taken over direct oversight of all his medications to ensure there are no further complications. He smiled at them, a real smile, the kind he'd never offered Megan. You can be assured that we're taking every precaution. Mrs. Davis's eyes widened slightly. Her hand moved to her son's shoulder. Before access was documented, Megan heard herself say, calm. Level. All medications were verified against the orders before administration. Dr. Ashford's smile didn't falter. He turned to face her fully, and in his eyes she saw something like satisfaction, the look of a hunter who'd just flushed out his prey. Did I ask you to speak, Nurse O'Brien? The room went dead silent. Corporal Davis's father shifted his weight. His mother's jaw tightened. The documentation is there, Megan said again, because the alternative was letting a lie stand in front of a frightened family, and she'd learned a long time ago that small silences could become big ones if you weren't careful. Yes, and that's the problem. Dr. Ashford turned back to the Davis family. Inconsistent nursing notes are a red flag in patient safety. It suggests either carelessness or, he paused, his voice taking on a note of almost clinical concern, deliberate falsification. Either way, it's a matter we need to address. He looked at Megan directly then, and his eyes held the kind of power that came from institutional authority. Which is it, Nurse O'Brien? Carelessness or dishonesty? It wasn't a question meant to be answered. It was meant to land. And it did. At 11:22 a.m., the announcement came. Megan was standing at the nurse's station updating the shift log when Dr. Ashford appeared with his tablet, his expression arranged into something resembling administrative efficiency. The day shift was present. 2 residents. A med student rotating through. The physician's assistant who'd been kind to her once, 6 months ago, before it became clear that kindness toward Megan could become a liability. I wanted everyone to hear this directly, Dr. Ashford said, his voice level and professional. Effective immediately, Nurse O'Brien is being reassigned to the night hospice wing. The documentation issues we've been addressing require a transition, and I think a change of scenery will give her an opportunity to refocus on the fundamentals. He glanced at her, his expression the picture of benevolent concern. It's not a punishment. It's a reassignment designed to help her succeed. The hospice wing. The quiet place. The place where machines weren't expected to beep with urgency, where the work was important but invisible, where a nurse could disappear into the margins and no one would notice. Megan felt the weight of it land somewhere beneath her ribs. The night shift starts tomorrow, Dr. Ashford continued. I trust that will work with your schedule. It wasn't a request. The room knew it. He knew it. And he was watching her face, waiting to see if she would crack under the weight of it all, the humiliation, the isolation, the systematic dismantling of her credibility in front of her colleagues. She took one measured breath. The morning light was coming through the windows at an angle that turned everything pale and thin. Someone had spilled coffee near the computer terminal. She could smell it, bitter and stale. One tear escaped, hot and uninvited. She reached up and wiped it away, her hand steady, her eyes never breaking contact with his. "I've seen good men die for integrity," she said quietly, her voice pitched so only he could hear. "I can handle a shift change." The break room at 11:38 a.m. was where the silence became a weapon of its own. Megan pushed through the door looking for water, for a moment alone, for anything that might reset the morning back to something manageable. 5 nurses sat around the table, some from her shift, some from days, eating lunch and talking about the weekend. The moment they saw her, the conversation stopped. Not paused. Stopped. Mid-sentence. One of them had his mouth open when she walked in. The sound of plastic forks against foam trays became impossibly loud. "I'm just grabbing water," Megan said. Nobody responded. She moved to the refrigerator, pulled out a bottle, felt the cold against her palm. She turned back toward the door. "See you guys at shift change," she offered. Within 7 seconds, she would count them later, unable to stop herself. All 5 of them gathered their things and left. One didn't even take her trash with her. The door swung shut on their absence, leaving Megan alone in the break room with the abandoned food and the fluorescent lights that buzzed like something dying. She sat down anyway. Set the water bottle on the table in front of her. Stared at nothing for a very long time. At 2:06 a.m., the first alarm sounded. Megan was still on the day shift, still 3 hours before the night rotation would officially begin, still moving through Oak Creek Memorial like a ghost in scrubs. She was restocking the supply cart near the trauma bays when the overhead system came alive. "Code Blue, Trauma 2. Code Blue, Trauma 2. The words weren't unusual. The frequency at 2 a.m. was unusual. The sound of multiple voices, urgent and overlapping, was unusual. She heard the helicopter rotors before she heard the announcement, "Incoming trauma from Route 9. MVA with ejection. ETA 5 minutes." Her hands kept moving even as her mind was already calculating. 5 minutes meant no surgeon in the room yet, meant skeleton crew, meant the first person to stabilize was going to be whoever was closest when the patient arrived. She abandoned the supply cart and moved toward the trauma bay. By the time the stretcher came through the doors, there were 3 trauma patients stacked in rapid succession. The first was barely conscious, a 24-year-old male with a steering wheel imprint on his sternum and breathing that came in shallow, painful gasps. The second was worse, unconscious, pupils blown, blood running from his nose. The third was a woman in her 60s with a compound fracture of the femur that was bleeding through for layers of gauze. Dr. Ashford was in trauma 2 with the unconscious patient. She watched from the hallway as he moved through the initial assessment, hands shaking slightly, orders coming out a half-beat too slow. He called for a chest tube. Someone retrieved the equipment. The resident, a careful woman named Chen who'd been at Oak Creek for 8 months, was standing near the gurney. 14-gauge needle, Dr. Ashford said. His voice had lost its authority. Second intercostal space. The needle went in. Nothing came out. No air. No fluid. Just a hollow absence where there should have been pressure release. Megan's breath caught in her chest. Wrong placement. Or wrong patient. Either way, wrong. She moved without deciding to move. Her hands retrieved a .28 French chest tube from the tray. Antiseptic swab. Scalpel already gloved. When had that happened? She was moving in a rhythm older than her civilian life, older than the 3 years of nursing school and the medical discharge that had supposedly made her something safe and manageable. Second intercostal space is too high, she heard herself say. Nipple line. 4th or 5th space. Mid-axillary. Dr. Ashford's head came up. His eyes went narrow. But the patient's oxygen saturation was dropping. 88, 82. 77, the numbers were a countdown toward arrest, and every second she stood still was a second the patient didn't breathe. Now, doctor, Megan said. It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered in a voice that didn't belong to anyone Dr. Ashford had ever met. Or I do it. The patient's O2 was 73 now. His lips were turning grey. Dr. Ashford stepped back. Megan moved into the space he'd left. The palpate landmarks took 2 seconds, rib 2, rib 4, the intercostal space between them, and muscle memory took over. Scalpel through skin. Quick incision. The pop of the fascia giving way. Breath that wasn't a breath, that was the sound of pressure finally releasing, that was the sound of a patient who might survive the next hour. She threaded the tube through the opening with the kind of precision that came from having done it dozens of times while bullets were flying, while the screaming wouldn't stop, while her hands had to be steadier than her heartbeat because lives depended on it. Sinus rhythm. The monitor screened it. The patient's oxygen climbing. 87, 91, 94, 97. The trauma bay went silent except for the ventilator's mechanical breath. Dr. Ashford's face had gone the color of something dead. "Hand me the suture kit," Megan said quietly. Nobody moved. In the quiet, in the space between heartbeats, she heard something that sounded like the desert. Sand. Wind. The sound of a mortar in the distance, the smell of burned metal, the weight of a rifle sling across her shoulder. She could taste blood, not this patient's, but hers, from 3 years ago, when a piece of shrapnel had entered her body from an angle that shouldn't have been possible and everything afterward had become negotiation instead of mission. She blinked. The trauma bay clarified. The fluorescent lights. The monitors. The patient's chest rising and falling with mechanical precision. The resident staring at her like she'd just walked through the wall instead of just through the door. "Suture kit," she said again, and her voice was her own now, but it had taken something essential with it when the desert finally let go. One of the residents moved. Placed the kit on the tray. Watched her hands, which were steady in a way that seemed to hurt everyone who was watching them work. The trauma bay had finally emptied by 4:13 a.m. Megan restocked the crash cart with methodical precision, pushing the experience of the thoracotomy down into the locked compartment where she kept everything else. The EKG electrode pads she'd used. The 18-gauge needle she'd threaded between ribs. The smell of adrenaline and copper blood that still clung to her scrubs like evidence. She worked alone because this was the hospice wing now, the graveyard shift, the place where transfers went to fade quietly. Her shoulder ached where shrapnel had scarred 3 years ago. The older wound, the one from Kandahar. Sometimes in the pre-dawn hours, when her hands moved through muscle memory she was supposed to have retired from nursing school, the pain would spike, a ghost nerve firing at a ghost memory. She'd learned to breathe through it. Room for 12 was dark except for the monitor's soft glow. Corporal Davis slept with the ragged breathing of a man still processing morphine and trauma, his chest rising and falling beneath the blue hospital gown. She'd seen him watching her earlier in the evening, something clicking behind his eyes every time she moved. Recognition maybe. Or just a patient's desperate gratitude toward whoever was taking care of him. She didn't allow herself to wonder which. The hallway was empty. The kind of empty that belonged to hospitals at that hour, the kind where the building itself seemed to hold its breath between shifts. Fluorescent panels buzzed overhead in that particular way that made her teeth ache. She was reaching for the medication cart when she heard the elevator doors slide open at the far end of the corridor. Footsteps. Fast. Not the shuffle of a nurse heading to rounds. A man in a navy blazer rounded the corner carrying a leather briefcase pressed against his chest like armor. He wasn't hospital staff. His shoes were too expensive, his jaw too tight, his eyes too focused on room for 12. Behind him trailed a hospital security guard who looked deeply confused about his own presence here. "That room," the man in the blazer said to the guard. "Not a question." Then he pushed past Megan without making eye contact. She was already moving. Not thinking. Never thinking. The door to room for 12 was closing behind him when her hand caught it. "Dr. Ashford sent you," she said. Not a question either. The man turned. His face was the kind that had never learned to lose arguments. "Medical transfer." Court order. Corporal Davis requires treatment at a private facility. Megan's eyes flicked to the briefcase. The way he held it. The tension in his shoulders. Show me the order. That's not your concern, nurse. Behind him, Corporal Davis was stirring. The morphine was wearing thin. She could see his eyes moving beneath closed lids, his breath accelerating. Whatever Dr. Ashford had arranged, it wasn't legitimate. The paperwork didn't exist because the paperwork couldn't exist, not if they were moving a patient in the middle of his treatment cycle, not with a man carrying a briefcase like it contained something that needed burning. I need to wake the attending, she said. The man's hand came out of his jacket pocket fast, not with a weapon but with something else, a phone, already dialing, his eyes never leaving hers. Your attending is on an emergency call I'm about to make. By the time he's free, we'll be gone. Corporal Davis's eyes snapped open. Morphine confused, disoriented, his hand already reaching for the forestand as if he could tear it out and run. The monitor beat frantically as his heart rate climbed. 95, 108. 127. Davis, stay in the bed, Megan said. Her voice had changed pitch. Lower. It wasn't a suggestion. He froze. Muscle memory responding to something in her tone that was older than his conscious mind. The man in the blazer moved toward the bed, briefcase swinging open as he approached. Megan saw the device inside for exactly 1 second, something electronic, something that looked like it had a timer, before her body made a decision her brain hadn't authorized. She lunged forward as Davis panicked and tried to roll away from the stranger, his hand catching the forestand, his legs tangling in the sheets. The briefcase shifted. The timer on the device inside hit 0. The explosion wasn't huge. But it was precise. The briefcase detonated with the specific goal of destroying evidence, obliterating whatever documents it contained, and the blast radius extended far enough to catch the window. Glass shattered inward like diamonds on fire, the frame buckling, metal groaning. Megan was already moving into Davis's airspace, her body covering his as the shrapnel came through. She felt it like memory, like Kandahar coming home again, the burn of metal tearing through tissue, the instant before pain kicks in when your body is just data and survival instinct. Her left shoulder exploded in heat. Her right side below the ribs. Her back where a larger piece caught her between the scapulae. She didn't make a sound. The noise around her was enough, the crash of glass, the alarm shrieking, the briefcase still smoking on the floor, Davis screaming beneath her in a way that sounded like his wounds were opening again. Field position, she barked against his chest. Now. He dropped flat. The training took over, something this kid had learned in basic that she'd just reactivated with 3 words. His body pressed into the mattress as another piece of glass came through where his head had been. Megan rolled off him, her hands already assessing. Pain was information. Pain was just data. The shoulder wound was bleeding freely, her scrubs turning dark, but arterial was fast and this wasn't fast enough. The rib wound was worse, she could feel the depth of it, the trajectory, the way it was pulling toward her lung with each breath. She was up before the room finished registering the explosion. Her hands moved through the crash cart like she'd trained yesterday instead of 4 years ago. Trauma shears. She cut her scrub top away, the air hitting her skin like a second shock. The faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, hidden there for 3 years, was visible now against the blood-stained uniform beneath. Tell me your name, she said to Davis, not looking at him, her hands already packing the shoulder wound with sterile gauze. Press. Hold. Blood immediately soaking through. Press again. Corporal James Davis. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse. Yes. She wrapped the shoulder tight, tape securing the dressing in place with movements that belonged to a field hospital, not a civilian trauma bay. The rib wound was next. She could hear the security guard screaming into his radio outside. Could hear footsteps exploding into the hallway. Could hear her own breathing in a way that meant she was going into shock whether she acknowledged it or not. "Listen to me," she said, her voice steady as a surgical laser. "Your lung is intact. You're stable. You're going to be fine." Her hands moved to his chest, assessing, palpating, listening. She grabbed a pulse oximeter off the cart. His oxygen saturation was already dropping as adrenaline was wearing off and his body was remembering how to panic. 87, the number lit up red on the monitor. She was running through the intubation supplies when the doors burst open. Hospital staff. Security. Nurses she didn't recognize because she'd been transferred to the night shift, the isolation ward, the place where she could be disappeared without anyone noticing. O2 sat dropping, she announced, her voice cutting through the chaos like a command. Tracheal deviation on the left. He needs a needle decompression at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Now. A resident moved forward. Megan's hand came up without contact, pure authority in the gesture. "I'll do it." She had the needle out of the crash cart, a 14-gauge angiocath, before he could respond. Her hands were covered in her own blood but her fingers were steady. She found the landmark on Davis's chest in the millisecond it took to think it, felt the anatomical space beneath her fingers, felt the air waiting to escape. She pressed the needle in. The hiss. The sound of compressed lung deflating into the needle chamber, the pressure releasing, the body remembering how to breathe. She secured the catheter in place with tape that stuck to blood and skin with equal conviction. O2 sat climbing. 87, 89. 91, 94. "He's stable," she said. "Get him to CT, full trauma workup. Assume tension pneumothorax, possible hemothorax, contused lung fields." A nurse, someone from the day shift who'd gotten pulled in for the emergency, was staring at her with an expression Megan had learned to recognize. The look people got when they were watching someone operate in a space that didn't match their job title. The resident was speaking into his phone. A second nurse was already running fluids on Davis, already moving him toward the elevator. The briefcase, what was left of it, was being photographed by someone in a suit who wasn't hospital staff. Military police. Maybe something higher. Megan sat down on a wheeled stool. Not because she decided to sit. Because her body decided it had finished executing orders and now wanted to assess the damage. The shoulder was still bleeding. The rib wound was already starting to swell, bruising spreading across her skin like ink in water. "Excuse me," a voice said. "The suit from earlier. The patient said you." "She needs orthopedics and an ultrasound," another suit interrupted, this one with the bearing of someone used to giving orders to people who gave orders. "Blunt trauma, possible flail chest, debris contamination. Medical team. Now." Megan's vision was tunneling slightly. The lights had gotten very bright. She could hear the radio traffic now, confirm the casualty count, confirm the device type, confirm that this wasn't a suicide attempt but an assassination. The suit in charge was already on a phone call with someone important. Already describing what happened. Already making the kind of call that led to other calls. She looked down at her hands. They were steady. Even now. Even bleeding out slightly in a hospital hallway surrounded by people who had no idea who she was, those hands were absolutely, completely steady. The suit in charge looked at her. His eyes moved from her hands to her face, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition maybe. Or the beginning of a question about why a civilian nurse was operating like a combat medic in the middle of his crime scene. Before he could speak, Davis's voice came from the stretcher as they wheeled him past. "Valkyrie," he whispered. The word stopped the hallway. Not just the people in it, but the air itself seemed to pause. The suit's phone call faltered. A nurse froze mid-step. One of the military police officers turned sharply. "Valkyrie." Call sign from a lifetime ago. From a woman who wore boots instead of nursing clogs, who operated in darkness instead of under fluorescent lights, who saved lives in ways that required things to die first. The stretcher kept moving. The doors kept opening. The night shift kept pretending this was all normal, all routine, all just another Tuesday at Oak Creek Memorial. But the suit's eyes had changed. His hand was already moving to his phone again. And somewhere in the building, probably still in his office or maybe already getting a call of his own, Dr. Ashford was about to learn that there were questions about explosives and briefcases that he wasn't going to be able to make disappear with a phone call to the hospital board. Megan sat on the wheeled stool and waited for someone to finally ask her name. Military police flooded the corridors of Oak Creek Memorial like a tide, their uniforms a stark contrast to the pale blue walls and fluorescent hum that had become Megan's entire world. Dr. Ashford stood frozen near the elevators, his phone still pressed to his ear, his face draining of color as officers moved through the hallway with the coordinated precision of people who knew exactly what they were looking for. The briefcase. The court order. The evidence. Everything unraveled in the space of 90 seconds. Megan sat on a wheeled stool outside room for 12, her left shoulder wrapped in gauze that was already showing seepage, her right arm moving only when absolutely necessary. A military police lieutenant approached her with a tablet, asking questions in a steady voice. How many people had entered the room? What the briefcase contained? Whether she had witnessed the detonation? She answered each question in short, clipped sentences. Yes. No. Approximately 6 seconds. Pain is information. That was something they taught in combat medicine, treat pain as data, not as weakness. Her shoulder throbbed. The data said fragmentation wound, soft tissue damage, possible nerve involvement. The data said she needed surgery. The data also said she had saved a Marine's life in the 23 minutes between explosion and arrival of the first responders. Dr. Ashford made his first call at 4:18 a.m. from the hospital administrator's office. Megan could hear his voice carrying down the hallway, not quite loud enough to understand the words, but loud enough to know the tone. Desperation wrapped in arrogance. He was calling board members. She heard his voice spike at an unstable former employee. Then, history of erratic behavior. Then, clearly acting out some kind of trauma response. Each phrase was designed to chip away at her credibility, to paint the explosion as her fault, her negligence, her mental state rather than what it actually was, a murder attempt orchestrated by a physician who trafficked human organs through a network that stretched across 3 states. By 5:33 a.m., Dr. Ashford had positioned himself as the victim. Hospital administration began circulating an incident report that listed Megan as the primary operator of patient care in room for 12, which meant her presence, her decisions, her very existence near the scene of the explosion made her responsible. Security camera footage was being reviewed. The report mentioned her unsupervised access to restricted medication logs. No one said the words directly, but the implication hung in the hallway like antiseptic vapor. She had caused this. Or at minimum, she had failed to prevent it. By 7:22 a.m., she was removed from patient care duties pending investigation. A hospital administrator, a woman named Patricia Chen with kind eyes that couldn't quite hide her discomfort, handed Megan a printout. Administrative leave. Full pay suspended. Do not return to the unit pending security clearance. The words blurred. Megan's hands were steady as she took the papers, but her peripheral vision narrowed. This was what it felt like when the system ate you. Not with one catastrophic blow, but with 1,000 small calculated cuts designed to make sure you didn't bleed too visibly. She cleared her locker by 9:53 a.m. Her scrubs, still stained with Davis's blood and her own. Her name badge, which she placed on the shelf with the same care she would use handling a live explosive. Her coffee mug from the Navy Exchange, purchased during her last leave in San Diego, the one with the Semper Fidelis seal that no one at Oak Creek had ever asked about. And at the bottom, beneath her personal items, the faded unit patch. Wing shield. Valkyrie Squadron. She had sewn it into the lining of her jacket 8 months ago, a thread-thin connection to a life that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. She held the patch in her palm for exactly 4 seconds. Then she folded it into her jacket pocket instead of throwing it away, some part of her refusing to let go entirely. The rain started around 2:38 p.m. sheets of water that hammered against the windshield of her 2016 Honda Civic in the parking garage. She sat in the driver's seat with the engine off, her shoulder screaming every time she shifted position, watching hospital staff move between the levels like ants in a disrupted colony. None of them had fought for her. Not one. The trauma surgeon whose surgery she had walked through at 3 a.m. while Ashford was making his calls, he had said nothing. The charge nurse who had watched her work with quiet competence for 2 years, she had disappeared by morning. Arlington Cemetery was 37 minutes north. Megan drove through the rain without using the wipers consistently, letting the droplets blur her vision in a way that felt honest. James O'Brien's grave was in Section 42, marked by a standard military headstone that caught rain like a cup. She stood beside it with her arm in a sling, rain running down the back of her neck in sheets, and spoke to the man who had waited 18 months for her to come home the last time and never got the chance to wait again. "I finally had a chance to save someone again," she whispered, "and I still lost everything." The rain answered in percussion. James didn't. He had been gone for 3 years, 1 month, and 16 days. Dead from a stroke, sudden and senseless, while she was in Kandahar with a rifle and a radio and absolutely no way to get home before they lowered him into the ground. She had never forgiven herself for that. Now she was adding another failure to the monument, a chance to prove she was more than a nurse, a chance to demonstrate that the woman who had survived for combat tours still existed somewhere underneath the scrubs and civilian identity, and she had managed to weaponize even that. She was a liability. She was unstable. She was the problem. She pulled her phone out. 43 missed calls from unknown numbers. Likely reporters. Dr. Ashford was probably already circulating his narrative to the press, a heroic physician's attempt to save a patient complicated by an unpredictable employee with a history of military service. Military service always sounded sinister when filtered through the right media lens. Unstable. Trained in violence. Prone to overreaction. She could already hear it. She opened the contacts menu and hovered over the discharge papers from her medical separation. A name. A number. A phone line that existed for exactly one situation. She had never used it. 3 years of civilian life and she had kept that number like a loaded weapon she hoped never to need. Her thumb moved toward the call button. Then she heard it. Distant at first, almost inaudible beneath the rain. The rhythmic percussion of rotors. Coming from the north. Low and deliberate, like the sound had weight and purpose. Megan looked up from the grave toward the sound, rain streaming down her face. 1 helicopter. No, 2. The sound doubled, tripled. Multiple aircraft moving in formation. Coming this direction. She had heard that sound exactly once in the past 3 years, in a news broadcast about a presidential movement. She had never heard it coming toward her. The helicopters passed overhead 30 seconds later. 3 of them. UH-60M Blackhawks, the silhouettes unmistakable even through the rain. They were heading toward Raleigh. Toward Oak Creek Memorial. Toward Corporal Davis. Megan's phone rang before the rotors faded. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Then she pressed the phone to her ear and heard a voice that stopped her breathing. Major O'Brien. A woman's voice. Precise. Military bearing evident in 3 syllables. "I'm calling from the Pentagon. We need to discuss a patient in your hospital." The fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor burned with an antiseptic harshness as federal agents moved through Oak Creek Memorial like a systematic tide. Their badges caught the sterile glow, FBI emblazoned across Navy windbreakers, NCIS seals gleaming. Boots on tile. Click, click, click. The sound echoed down the hallway where Megan stood, her left shoulder wrapped in fresh gauze, her arm cradled against her ribs. Her scrubs were still stained, rust-colored spots near the cuff that no amount of hospital washing protocol could scrub entirely clean. Dr. Ashford's face had gone the color of old newspaper when the first agent turned toward the administrative wing. The evening news anchor's voice still hung in the air like smoke. 12 million viewers. That's what they told her in the waiting room. 12 million people had watched the three-star general call into the live broadcast, his voice cutting through the studio with a kind of authority that made talking heads go silent. The general had sat in his office somewhere in the Pentagon, and he'd simply decided that Dr. Ashford's career was going to end on national television. Major O'Brien took shrapnel defending one of ours. Again. Those had been his exact words. The camera had captured Ashford's collapse in real time, the blood draining from his face, the way his hand started shaking, the moment he understood that his network, his leverage, his carefully constructed architecture of influence meant nothing when measured against a three-star general and 12 million watching eyes. Meghan watched from the corridor as an agent approached Ashford's office. The doctor emerged in the doorway, briefcase in hand, resignation papers already printed. He'd tried to run the moment the news broke. Security footage showed him deleting files at his computer at 7:14 p.m., 43 minutes after the general's statement went live. Too slow. The FBI had already seized his hardware. Everything was still there. The altered medication dosages. The authorization codes for the organ trafficking pipeline. The payment transfers from medical black market brokers in Eastern Europe. 47 patients over 18 months. That's what the agent had whispered to the hospital administrator, a number that made grown men pale. Ashford's hands trembled as he walked past Meghan toward the elevator. She didn't move. She didn't acknowledge him. She simply stood against the wall in her blood-stained scrubs, watching him shuffle past like a man walking toward his own execution. "You ruined me," he said. His voice was barely audible, cracked like old vinyl. Not a question. Not a plea. Just a statement of fact delivered to no one in particular. Meghan didn't respond. Her composure was absolute. One breath. One steady exhale. The elevator doors closed behind him. 75 combat veterans arrived at Oak Creek Memorial on a Tuesday morning 6 months later. They came in dress blues, their uniforms pressed sharp enough to cut, they're bearing the kind of military spine you don't manufacture in civilian life. They filled the hospital chapel where Meghan's reinstatement ceremony was being held. Colonels stood beside enlisted men. An admiral sat in the third row next to a hospital chaplain who looked entirely overwhelmed by the proceedings. The chief of medicine read her commendation in a voice that carried through the room like it was being delivered at Arlington. Major Meghan O'Brien. Medical discharge rescinded. Commendations restored. Full status reinstated. The words felt surreal after 3 years of pushing a mop, checking vitals, taking orders from a man who'd never accomplished anything larger than his own ambition. But the moment that broke her was when Corporal Davis walked forward. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone still healing, his arm no longer in a sling but his movement still cautious, still favoring his left side where the shrapnel had torn through muscle before Meghan had thrown herself across him. He carried something small in his hands. Wrapped in blue velvet. When he opened it, the room went absolutely silent. The unit patch. The Valkyrie insignia, the wing shield that had been sewn into the lining of her jacket for 5 years before that explosion had torn it free. It sat now in a black frame, mounted on a walnut plaque that bore a single inscription, "To the one who came back." Corporal Davis placed the frame into her hands, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Oak Creek Memorial, since she'd buried her husband in the rain, since she'd accepted that her life as a warrior was finished, Meghan O'Brien let herself cry. Not the single tear of composed restraint. Not the measured grief of a private moment at a graveside. She let the tears come while 75 combat veterans watched, while the Admiral nodded, while everyone in that room finally understood what it meant to stand among warriors. "Welcome home, Major," Davis said. His voice held everything, the shrapnel, the explosion, the 48 hours of hemorrhaging in hospital beds, the moment she'd saved his life by diving on top of him. Welcome home. The next chapter began the same way the old one had, with Meghan O'Brien in scrubs, checking vitals at Oak Creek Memorial. But this time when she moved through the corridors, nurses straightened their spines. Residents stepped aside. The attending physicians consulted her on trauma cases. The hospital had undergone a complete restructuring in the aftermath of Ashford's exposure, a new veteran trauma wing, dedicated staff trained in military-specific PTSD protocols, a federal oversight board that made sure no doctor could hide behind institutional politics ever again. She was offered the director position. Chief of Trauma Services. An office on the administrative floor. A salary with 6 figures. They presented it to her at a formal dinner, the board members all in suits, the hospital president speaking about legacy and leadership and the incredible opportunity to shape the future of emergency medicine in North Carolina. Megan listened. She smiled. She thanked them with genuine appreciation. Then she chose to return to the night shift. Why? The president asked, genuinely confused. You've earned the right to. My fight is here now, Megan said. She tapped her stethoscope against her chest. Not in an office. Here. With the patients who can't advocate for themselves. With the nurses who need to know someone has their back. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the discipline of choosing the harder path because it mattered more. Scars tell stories. The shrapnel scars on Megan's shoulder and ribs told one story. The scar tissue around her heart told another. 3 years of being erased, of being a ghost in her own life, of having to watch a man exploit the system that was supposed to protect the vulnerable, those scars had created something harder, sharper, more focused than any combat training could forge. She was standing at the nurse's station at 11:51 p.m., reviewing admission notes for an incoming trauma patient, when she noticed the young Navy medic watching her from the doorway. He was holding flowers. Badly arranged, like he'd grabbed them from a gas station, but bright, yellow sunflowers that had no business being in a hospital at midnight. You probably have regulations about that, he said. His smile was nervous, hopeful. He'd been the SEAL attached to the investigation team, the one who'd coordinated with the FBI, the one whose respect had shifted to something different somewhere between the depositions and the commendation hearing. Megan looked at the flowers. Looked at him. Her eyes held his for exactly 3 seconds. I'm going on break, she said. Regulations don't cover flowers given during breaks. The smile that crossed his face was the kind that could warm a room full of fluorescent lights. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the deliberate choice to let someone in, to risk something smaller than your life but somehow harder to surrender. Oak Creek Memorial transformed into something different under Megan's watch. She trained nurses in recognizing predatory behavior from physicians. She established protocols that mandated peer review for any restricted medication access. She created a veteran advocate position that was filled immediately by a former Army nurse who'd experienced similar isolation. The hospital became a place where compassion and accountability occupied the same space, where strength wasn't measured in hospital hierarchy but in the willingness to protect the vulnerable. And every night at 11:11 p.m., Major Megan O'Brien, formerly invisible, formerly erased, formerly just another nurse, would move through the corridors of Oak Creek Memorial with the kind of quiet authority that comes from having already survived the worst the world can offer. Patients relaxed when she entered their rooms. Residents deferred to her judgment. The nurses working the night shift knew that if something went wrong, if someone tried to abuse the system, if predators tried to hide in the shadows of hospital protocol, there was someone walking these corridors who understood predators with the intimacy of a warrior. Her fight wasn't finished. It had simply evolved into a different kind of combat, one waged with stethoscopes instead of rifles, with medical ethics instead of rules of engagement, with the absolute refusal to let another person disappear on her watch. Somewhere in a strip mall outside Raleigh, in a folding chair behind a folding table, Dr. Ashford was selling insurance policies to people who would never know his name, who would never understand the empire he'd built and lost. Every time someone asked if he'd ever been a doctor, his eyes would flinch. Every time a nurse walked past, he would remember the moment a 3-star general had dismantled him on live television. But Megan didn't think about him anymore. She was too busy with the work. Too focused on the next patient. Too committed to the kind of silent strength that changes systems from the inside, one shift at a time, one life saved at a time. True class is what you do when the lights go out. And in the darkness of Oak Creek Memorial's night shift, Megan O'Brien was exactly where she was meant to be. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt unseen despite your expertise, if you've witnessed corruption and wondered if speaking up was worth the cost, please subscribe to our channel. Like this video and comment. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who you really were? Because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone overlooks.